I never believed in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. Not really. But one weekend at my grandfather's old cabin changed everything. Growing up, I'd visit him every summer until he passed away when I was 15. He'd left the cabin to my parents, but they never really used it. The place was old, creaky, and, as they like to joke, probably haunted. But my grandfather had loved it, and oddly, so did I. Even after he was gone, something about the smell of the pine, the crispness of the mountain air, and the distant calls of birds kept me drawn to it. It had been almost 8 years since I'd been up there, but that fall I decided I needed some time away from the city. My job was slowly eating away at me, and my girlfriend, well, let's just say things were rocky. A few days alone in the mountains sounded perfect, and what better place than the cabin? The drive was mostly uneventful, winding up mountain roads as the forest thickened around me. When I arrived, everything looked just like I remembered. It was quaint, almost charming, with its rough wooden walls and a slight lean from years of harsh winters. I unloaded my bags and did a quick sweep, checking for any signs of unwanted animal visitors. The place was quiet, eerily so. No hum of distant traffic, no chirping of crickets. Just silence. That first night was cold, and I started a fire in the stone fireplace, curling up with a book and a blanket. The sound of crackling would fill the room, and I felt my eyes growing heavy. I wasn't even sure I had drifted off until I heard a distinct creaking, like someone was walking just outside the front door. I sat up, listening, straining to catch any sound. But after a minute, all was silent again. Just an animal, I muttered, settling back in, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to shake off the weirdness from the night before. I made coffee and took a stroll around the cabin. Memories flooded back as I wandered down to the old dock by the lake. I remembered my grandfather teaching me to fish, his rough hands guiding mine. He had been a man of few words, but he always seemed content here. When I returned to the cabin, I froze. The door was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd closed it. Heart pounding, I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. I searched every corner, every closet, but nothing seemed out of place. Maybe I'd just forgotten to close it, but a lingering unease had settled over me. As night fell, the atmosphere in the cabin grew tense. Shadows seemed to flicker just out of sight, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, convinced someone was there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but that night was worse. The same creaking footsteps, only this time they were inside. I listened, paralyzed, as they grew closer, stopping just outside my bedroom door. I was too scared to move, lying there in the dark, clutching the covers like a child. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I lay awake the rest of the night, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the cabin was silent again. When dawn broke, I was exhausted but too afraid to stay. I packed my things, ready to leave, but when I opened the door, something stopped me. A trail of muddy footprints led from the lake to the cabin, fresh and unmistakable. I stared at them, my mind racing. Had someone been watching me from the lake? I followed the trail, each step pulling me closer to the water. It stopped abruptly at the dock, right where I used to fish with my grandfather. The lake was still, a mirror reflecting the gray sky, but I had the sickening feeling that something was watching me from below its surface. I backed away, shivering, and returned to the cabin. I tried to call my parents, but there was no cell signal, no way to reach anyone. With no choice but to stay, I barricaded the door and sat in front of the fireplace, determined to stay awake. I'd just wait out the night and leave at first light. But then I noticed something odd. The walls, specifically the wall behind the fireplace. The wood was different, a shade lighter, as if it had been replaced. I ran my hand over it, feeling the faint grooves of an opening. There was a hidden door there, one I'd never noticed as a kid. My curiosity got the best of me. I found a small latch and pulled. The door opened to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I hesitated, but something, maybe a sense of duty to my grandfather's memory, compelled me to go down. The air grew colder as I descended, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. And in the center of the room was a table with a dusty, leather-bound book. The book was written in a language I couldn't understand, but the drawings were clear. They depicted rituals, figures in shadowy cloaks, and a creature emerging from the lake. As I flipped through, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just any creature, it was something ancient, something evil. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a faint shuffling. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to move, coiling around me. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the hidden door behind me, and ran back to the living room. The room was different now, darker. Shadows clung to the walls, and a feeling of dread settled over me. I tried to shake it off, but then I saw it. A figure stood in the corner, watching me. It was barely visible, more of a silhouette than a person, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding. I blinked, and it was gone, but the air still felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. I tried to calm myself, rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the power of suggestion from that creepy book. But deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. Then I heard a whisper, a low, guttural voice calling my name. Daniel. My blood turned to ice. My grandfather was the only one who had ever called me Daniel. Everyone else called me Dan, but he was dead. I'd seen him buried. And yet, the voice was unmistakable. I bolted for the door, desperate to escape, but when I reached it, it wouldn't budge. I yanked, pulled, even kicked, but it was as if the door had fused to the wall. The whisper grew louder, filling the cabin. Shadows swirled around me, and the figure reappeared, closer this time. I stumbled back, heart racing, as it reached out a skeletal hand. Daniel, it rasped, "You've come back." I screamed, thrashing, trying to shake off its grip, but it was like being caught in a nightmare. The figure's face was twisted, barely human, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. It leaned in close, and I caught a whiff of decay, rotten and foul. "You left me," it whispered. "You left us." Suddenly, I remembered something I had long forgotten. My grandfather, standing by the lake, talking to himself. No, not to himself, to someone. I had thought it was harmless, just a quirk of old age. But now, staring into the hollow eyes of this thing, I realized he hadn't been alone. The shadows tightened around me, pressing closer, whispering my name over and over. I felt myself slipping, my mind unraveling. Desperate, I screamed, "What do you want?" The voices fell silent, and the figure leaned in, its face inches from mine, to finish what was started. And with that, everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the dock by the lake, the sun just beginning to rise. I scrambled to my feet, looking around in a daze. The cabin stood silent, watching me. I grabbed my bags, stumbled to my car, and didn't look back. I never returned to the cabin, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I feel a chill in the air, and I hear the faintest whisper. "Daniel." I hear that voice whispering my name, soft but persistent, as if calling me back. I've tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of my exhausted mind. But each time I think I've moved on, the memories claw their way back, more vivid than before. Weeks passed, then months, and I started to think maybe it was over. I focused on work, tried to rebuild things with my girlfriend, and for the most part, life felt normal again. But late at night, I'd wake up with a start, my heart pounding, and feel the unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. The worst part was the dreams, visions of the cabin, the lake, and that thing lurking in the shadows. It was as if something in me had been torn open, allowing pieces of that night to seep through into my life. My friends noticed the change. "You're not yourself," they'd say. "You look haunted." I shrugged it off, laughed when they suggested therapy, but deep down I was losing control. Then, one night, almost a year after that terrifying trip, I received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar, yet impossible. It was my grandfather's. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with one line scrawled in the shaky, slanted script I remembered. "Come back. There's unfinished business." The letter was signed with his initials. I dropped it, backing away as if it were something venomous. My mind raced. He was dead, long gone. This was impossible. But as I stared at the paper, something in me snapped. I needed to know. I needed answers. 2 days later, I found myself on the road, the cabin looming in my thoughts. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I couldn't explain it, even to myself. It was as if something was pulling me like a hook lodged deep in my mind, dragging me back to that cursed place. When I arrived, the cabin looked as it always had, quiet, unassuming, almost inviting in the morning light. But the air felt thick, heavy, as though the whole forest was holding its breath. I steeled myself, gripping the handle, and stepped inside. The place looked just as I'd left it, still almost untouched. But as I moved through the rooms, memories flooded back, and I felt a creeping dread build with each step. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that at any moment I would turn and see something lurking behind me. I decided to go down to the hidden room beneath the fireplace. The stairwell was damp and smelled of earth, and as I descended, the air grew colder. I reached the small room, barely able to see, and there it was, the leather-bound book, sitting in the exact same spot as before. The symbols on the walls seemed darker now, almost pulsing. I flipped through the book, scanning its ancient pages, searching for some clue, some explanation. Then, at the very back, I found something new, scrawled in messy handwriting. A note read, "You left me here." My blood ran cold. Had my grandfather written this? Or was it something else? The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. I turned to leave, but as I reached the stairs, I heard it, a faint whisper, almost drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. "Daniel." My body went rigid. I forced myself up the stairs, refusing to look back, and when I reached the top, I slammed the hidden door shut, leaning against it as my chest heaved with panic. Then I saw, standing in the doorway was the figure, barely visible in the dim light. Its hollow eyes were locked onto mine, an almost accusing look on its twisted face. I was rooted in place, helpless under its gaze. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another, and I felt the icy grip of terror tighten around me. "Why did you leave?" it whispered, its voice carrying a strange, echoing resonance. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My mind raced, trying to understand, to make sense of this nightmare. "What are you?" I finally managed to choke out. Its face twisted into a grotesque smile. "I am what you buried, what you left to rot." And then, in a flash of twisted memories, I remembered. When I was a kid, I had gone fishing with my grandfather one cold October morning. I thought he was talking to himself, but he'd been muttering something about keeping them quiet. I hadn't thought much of it. He'd always been a little eccentric. But that day, he'd taken me to the lake, told me to look away, and there had been a splash, something sinking below the surface. The figure moved closer, reaching out a skeletal hand. "You left me here, Daniel," it hissed. "You let me drown." I backed away, stumbling, trying to grasp the horror of what it was saying. This wasn't just some spirit. It was something we had hidden in that lake. Something he'd wanted me to forget, but it hadn't forgotten me. The figure lunged, and I bolted, my mind blank with terror. I ran through the cabin, down the hall, and out the door, feeling the cold shadow behind me, gaining with each step. As I reached the edge of the lake, I stopped, turning to face it. It stood there, almost pitiful, as if tethered to the cabin by some invisible chain. Its hollow eyes bored into me, and I felt a wave of sorrow mixed with terror. I could feel its suffering, its longing to be free. "Finish it," it whispered. In a daze, I walked back to the cabin, returning to the hidden room. I opened the book, flipping through the pages, and realized what needed to be done. There was a ritual, one that could banish it, set it free, but it required something in return. I was willing to give anything to escape the torment of that creature, to free myself from the nightmare that had consumed me. I followed the instructions, lighting the candles, chanting the strange words inscribed in the book. The air grew colder, and I felt the presence drawing closer. As I finished the ritual, a searing pain shot through my chest. I collapsed, gasping, as the shadows gathered around me, enveloping me in darkness. When I opened my eyes, the cabin was silent, empty, as if nothing had happened. I looked around, expecting to see the figure, but there was nothing. The air was still, the oppressive weight gone. I staggered outside, collapsing on the dock. The lake was calm, and for the first time, I felt a strange peace settle over me. But as I stared into the water, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Just below the surface, a familiar shape drifted, pale and hollow-eyed, staring up at me with an expression of eternal despair. My reflection grinned back at me, twisted hollow, and then, in a voice not my own, I heard the whisper, "You're free now, Daniel, but I'll be waiting for you forever." The lake swallowed my reflection, and I felt the chains of the cabin lift, a weight lifted from my shoulders. Yet a piece of me remained, trapped forever beneath the dark waters. The curse had been broken, but at a price. I never believed in ghosts. I was the kind of person who laughed at horror movies, shrugging off anything supernatural as products of an overactive imagination. But there's one experience I can't shake off, no matter how much I try. Even as I write this, part of me questions if I'm just dreaming, if I somehow imagined all of it. But I know, deep down, what happened was real. It all started when my old college roommate, Mike, suggested a weekend trip to Arcadia, a small, almost deserted town upstate. He'd come across an old house on a rental site. Only $50 a night, he'd said over the phone, practically buzzing with excitement. Can you believe it? This place looks straight out of the 1800s. Think of the pictures we could take. Mike's a photographer, and he lives for the chance to capture untouched places. He convinced me to join, promising it would be an adventure. The drive took hours, through winding roads and forests that grew thicker and darker the further we got from the city. There was no cell service once we hit the town limits, which made finding the place even harder. Arcadia was practically dead, with just a few scattered houses and a general store that looked like it hadn't been restocked in decades. The old man behind the counter eyed us strangely as we grabbed some snacks. "Y'all aren't headed to the old Parker house, are you?" he asked, squinting at us. His voice was barely more than a whisper. Mike, ever the bold one, replied, "Yeah, that's where we're staying." "Why?" The old man sucked his teeth and shook his head. "Don't stay there. People go in, but they don't always come back right." He didn't elaborate, just gave us this long, serious look that made my stomach twist. Mike laughed it off as small-town superstition, but I wasn't as confident. The closer we got to the house, the heavier the air felt, like something was pressing down on my chest. And when we finally saw it, I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back. The Parker house stood alone on the edge of a field, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to reach for it like skeletal fingers. The house itself was massive, with crumbling stone walls and ivy creeping over almost every inch. It looked like it had been abandoned for centuries. Even Mike seemed a bit put off, but he quickly covered it with a grin, nudging me with his elbow. "Looks awesome, right? Think of all the history in this place." Inside, the house was even darker, colder, and somehow more oppressive than it looked from the outside. The floors creaked with every step, and the smell of damp and decay clung to the air. Every room we passed felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there, like the house was watching us. There was a staircase in the main hallway that spiraled up into darkness. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I looked at it, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. But Mike was already bounding up, his footsteps echoing through the silence. "Come on, man. There's probably an amazing view from up here." I reluctantly followed, every step feeling heavier than the last. The second floor was lined with doors on both sides, most of them locked or jammed shut. At the end of the hall was a door that hung slightly open, revealing a room with a large, dusty window overlooking the overgrown garden. "This'll be my room," Mike announced, already unpacking his camera gear. I noticed that he was avoiding the mirror on the wall, which was cracked and covered in a thin layer of grime. There was something wrong with it, something unsettling about the way it seemed to reflect the room just a bit too darkly, like it was capturing shadows that shouldn't be there. After setting up, we wandered the house, exploring each creaky corner, taking pictures of the dust-laden furniture, old portraits that seemed to follow us with their hollow eyes, and ancient knickknacks strewn around. There was one particular painting that caught my eye. A woman in a black dress, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes almost lifelike. The more I looked, the more it seemed like her eyes were moving, darting from Mike to me. That night, we sat around in the dusty parlor, swapping old stories and laughing about the haunted house vibes. By the time we decided to go to bed, it was well past midnight. I took the room next to Mike's and shut the door, feeling a strange sense of relief, like I was safe now that I was alone. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified in the silence, like it was alive, shifting, breathing. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were soft, deliberate, like someone was pacing outside my door. I assumed it was Mike, so I got up, opening the door to tell him to cut it out. But when I looked, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the floorboard still creaking, as if someone was walking away from me, down the stairs. A chill ran through me, but I convinced myself it was just the old house settling. I went back to bed, pulling the covers over my head, trying to ignore the strange sounds. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept going up and down the stairs, pausing outside my door every few minutes. The next morning I told Mike about it, but he just laughed. Probably just raccoons or something. Or you're just spooked because of the old man at the store. But something in his eyes told me he didn't quite believe that. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, like he expected to see someone standing there. The next few days passed in a blur of restless nights and strange occurrences. Shadows that shouldn't have been there. Whispers in the dead of night. Doors that creaked open on their own. Once, I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from the window to the foot of my bed. They were small, like a child's, and they stopped just inches from where I slept. But the worst part was the mirror in Mike's room. It seemed to draw him in, like he couldn't look away. I caught him staring into it more than once, his eyes wide and unfocused, like he was seeing something I couldn't. When I asked him about it, he'd just shake his head, muttering that he was fine. On the third night, I heard him talking to someone in his room. The walls were thin, so I could hear him murmuring, his voice low and steady. I assumed he was on the phone, but then I remembered there was no cell service. The next morning, Mike seemed different. His eyes were vacant, hollow. He barely spoke, only nodding or shaking his head when I tried to talk to him. He spent most of the day in his room, staring into that cursed mirror. It was like he was slipping away, becoming someone or something else. That night, I woke up to the sound of laughter. It was coming from Mike's room, a soft, childlike giggle that sent a chill down my spine. I crept out of bed, tiptoeing to his door, pressing my ear against the wood. The laughter stopped, and I heard Mike's voice, faint and distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "It's okay," he was saying. "I'll be here soon. I understand now." I threw open the door, desperate to pull him away from whatever had taken hold of him. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, his bags untouched, his camera lying on the floor, its lens cracked. And in the mirror, I saw him. He was standing there, on the other side, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. He reached out, pressing his hand against the glass, his mouth moving silently, as if he were screaming. I tried to reach for him, to pull him back, but as soon as my fingers touched the glass, it went cold and the image faded. Mike was gone. I searched the house, calling his name, tearing through every room, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he'd simply vanished. The only trace of him was the faint, childlike laughter that echoed through the halls, mocking me. I wanted to leave, but something kept me there, some invisible force that seemed to root me to the spot. I felt like I was being watched, like the eyes in the paintings were following me, the shadows shifting closer. In a daze, I wandered back to his room, my gaze drawn to the mirror. The crack in the glass seemed larger now, spiderwebbing across the surface, distorting my reflection. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't my reflection at all. It was Mike's. He was staring back at me, his eyes wide and pleading, his mouth moving as if he were begging me for help. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was like the mirror was holding me, trapping me in its cold, unyielding grip. And then I heard his voice, faint and distant, echoing in my mind. "It's too late," he whispered. "She has me now." I didn't know who she was, but I could feel her presence, cold and malevolent, lurking just behind the glass, watching us both with a hunger that made my skin crawl, spreading like spiderwebs across the surface. My reflection looked wrong, distorted, almost as if it wasn't me at all. The room around me grew colder, the air thick and heavy, and I could feel something watching, waiting. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something in the reflection that made my blood run cold. Standing behind me, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It looked like a child, small and frail, with hollow eyes and a pale face smeared with mud. I spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, silent and still. When I looked back at the mirror, the child was gone, but in its place was a faint outline of Mike's face, his eyes wide with fear, lips twisted in a silent scream. I staggered back, tripping over his camera bag, the cracked lens staring up at me like a broken eye. That's when I realized what I had to do. The mirror, it was a doorway, a trap, and somehow it had taken him. If I wanted to bring him back, I'd have to follow. I grabbed a flashlight and took a deep breath, pressing my hand against the glass. It was ice cold, and I could feel it pulling like a current dragging me under. The surface gave way, and suddenly I was through. I found myself in a twisted, dark version of the house. Everything was the same, but wrong. The walls were decayed, rotting, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mold and something else, something that smelled like death. I called out for Mike, but my voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, darting in and out of rooms, always just out of reach. I felt like I was being watched, stalked by something that was just waiting for me to let my guard down. As I moved through the house, I realized that the layout had changed. Hallways stretched on longer than they should have, twisting and turning in impossible ways. Doors that should have led back to the main hall opened into pitch-black rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. It was like the house was alive, shifting around me, trying to trap me. And then I heard it, the laughter, that same chilling, childlike giggle, echoing down the hall. It was close, too close. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw her, the little girl from the mirror, standing just a few feet away, watching me with those hollow eyes. Her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide, her teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. I ran, stumbling through the maze of hallways, the walls seeming to close in around me. I could hear her following, her footsteps soft but relentless, echoing through the darkness. Every turn I took led me deeper into the house, further away from the door I'd come through. It was as if the house itself was trapping me, pulling me down into its depths. After what felt like hours, I found myself in a room that I hadn't seen before. It was small, almost claustrophobic, with walls covered in old, faded wallpaper and a single, dusty mirror mounted on the opposite wall. In the center of the room was a chair, and slumped in that chair was Mike. He looked terrible, his skin pale and sunken, eyes hollow and blank. I rushed to him, shaking his shoulders, calling his name, but he didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the mirror, unblinking, like he was lost somewhere far away. Then, slowly, he turned to look at me. His eyes were empty, devoid of any recognition or life. He opened his mouth, and a voice came out, but it wasn't his voice. It was the voice of a child, high-pitched and filled with a sinister glee. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, grinning up at me with Mike's mouth. "We've been waiting for you." I stumbled back, my heart pounding, as he, or whatever had taken him, began to laugh. The sound was all around me, echoing through the walls, the floor, the very air. I turned to run, but the door had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall. "Leaving so soon?" The voice taunted, mocking, as the laughter grew louder, more distorted. Shadows began to move across the walls, stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. I was trapped, surrounded by the house's horrors, with no way out. In a desperate attempt, I turned back to the mirror, hoping that somehow it could take me back. I placed my hands on the glass, pressing, pleading, as the laughter and shadows closed in. And then suddenly the mirror shifted, pulling me through. I tumbled back into the real house, gasping for air, my heart pounding. The room was empty, the mirror cracked and silent. There was no sign of Mike, no sign of the girl or the twisted shadows. Just the old, dusty room, silent and still. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I was back in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove away, not daring to look back, the laughter still echoing in my mind. I reported Mike's disappearance to the police, but they found no trace of him. They questioned me for hours, asking why I'd left him, why I'd run. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to hysteria, a trauma response, said I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear his voice, calling to me from somewhere far away. The laughter echoes in my dreams, and I see the little girl's hollow eyes watching me from the darkness. The Parker house is still there, waiting. And somewhere inside, trapped beyond the mirror, Mike is waiting too, forever lost in that twisted, haunted place.